About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go on long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open, wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street, and as I reached the other side, I glanced back. I stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were still completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he'd been standing, to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street, and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving towards me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away, or pulled out my knife or my cell phone or anything at all. But I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept towards me. He stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What are you... What? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back into a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that has always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high, he looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. In a small orphanage, in a small village in Russia, there lives a young boy. His hair is jet black and messy, and he wears tattered jeans and an old, dingy gray shirt. Nothing is known of this boy. For 10 years, he sat in the bed of his room, never moving, never blinking, never eating or sleeping. In the 10 years, he's not seemed to age at all, continuing to look like a 7-year-old boy. The only thing that proved he was still alive was the slow rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, and the refusal to take his eyes off anyone who entered the room alone. A lone psychiatrist came over in an attempt to find out why the boy had done nothing in 10 years. He entered the room and shut the door behind him. 30 minutes later, the orphanage's nurse came back to check on the two of them. Opening the door, she saw the child, still sitting, still not moving, and eyes fixed on her. However, something seemed different. He appeared a slight amount larger, Not by much, but enough to make him look like a late 8 or early 9-year-old. The psychiatrist was no longer in the room. The door was the only exit, as the room had no windows, vents, or anything. And it was, in fact, in the exact center of the orphanage. He continued to sit, only seen occasionally by the lady who came in to check on him, and she never closed the door upon entry. A week or so later, 2 law enforcement personnel entered the orphanage, demanding to speak to the boy about the disappearance of the psychiatrist. The 2 of them entered, closing the door behind them as the head of the orphanage stood outside the door. 30 minutes passed, and not a sound came from the room. The head eased the door open, and the boy was still on the bed. But the officers were no longer there. The boy was now noticeably quite bigger, about the size of a 15-year-old. His skin was darker than usual, and he looked angrier than ever. But one thing remained the same: his cold, unforgiving eyes that stared at whoever entered. Eventually, the law group organized a large group of 10 officers to speak to the boy. They entered the room and left the door open, until one of the younger orphans ran up and shut it, apparently in a daze. The head quickly ran to reopen the door, and upon doing so, froze him in horror. A lone rumbling noise came from the room. "One more." If you go to that orphanage, you will see it continues to run. The orphans live in good care, health, and education. However, there is one room that you will see is boarded up and far from enterable. If you ask what is behind it, you will be removed forcefully from the orphanage. However, when no one's looking, if you place your ear to the door, you will hear a low, ominous growling sound. And if you listen for a bit, you will hear, "One more." I just want to start off by saying that if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course, most internships aren't, but it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up the season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and 2 other interns were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy of what was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles, such as How Sex Doesn't Work, instead of Rockabye Bivalve when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a baby sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles. So, when we saw the title card, Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns even did a small throat laugh at it. The happy-go-lucky music plays as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob playing outside and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The bubble splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, the sound is synced up with the animation, so yes, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that is common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward's in full frame and looks visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd, with SpongeBob in center frame. And he too is booing, very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing, though. What's odd is that everyone's eyes had been realistically animated. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI, and the pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children. Yet. The shot goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view outside of his porthole window is of a night sky, so it isn't very long after his concert. The unsettling part is at this point, there is no sound. Literally no sound. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking in this silence for about 30 seconds. And then he started to sob softly, putting his hands or tentacles over his eyes, and cried quietly for a full minute more. All while the sound in the background, very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on Squidward's face, and by slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you only look at shots 10 seconds apart, side by side. His sobbing gets louder, and more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it twists in on itself for a split second, and then goes back to normal. The wind through the trees sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is that this sound, along with Squidward's sobbing, sounded real. As if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes, and the sound was coming from the other side. As good a sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals, and never lasted for more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things seem too specific, but I've had time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. What we saw... God... What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. His face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his upturned face. Popped. He was naked down to his underwear, and his stomach was crudely cut open, and his entrails were lying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part for me was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem that the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We, of course, were mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it was just some sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, and half body in frame. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, and half body in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in a very realistic style, looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it were that of a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing, a deep baritone, lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds of this, the screen again twisted, showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew that he had to. This time, the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out, naked except for her underpants, and her entrails were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in shape and size to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after this second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like it was when this scene started. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done in the same realistic style like the others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot and pulsating. He just stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep-voiced laughing. And this time, the photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and backed up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age, but this scene was different. The entrails were being pulled out of the stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next was different. We couldn't tell what. He went on to the next. Same thing. He went back to the first and played them quicker. And I lost it. I vomited on the floor. The animating and sound editors gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts, and we saw one of the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call on the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within 15 minutes. He was confused as why he was called down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming and sound stopped again. Squidward was just staring at the viewer, full frame of the face, for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and a deep voice said, "Do it." And we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately pulls the gun to his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatter the wall behind him, and his bed. He flies back from the force. The last 5 seconds of the episode show his body on the bed, on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg was obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the heck was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind and cause me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show that it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as the timestamp may have glitched and shown the wrong time. But everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified, and no clues were gathered from the data, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before. But now that I have something happen, and I can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things. I love my mice, ever so much. You see, I own a little colony containing hundreds of mice, all finely bred and engineered in this very laboratory. But But these are no ordinary lab mice, as they've advanced far past crawling through mazes for food. What began as a small nest of captured specimens from the wilderness, cold and hungry, struggling for survival, has grown into a brilliant hive that defies all laws of nature. The mice have learned and built, even beyond what I've trained them to do in the beginning. They don't just learn, either. They educate one another and seek knowledge themselves. And though their little civilization thrives independently, they still know that I am their master. Long ago, I used to fear that as the mice grew more intelligent, they would no longer need me and overthrow not only myself, but the entire laboratory. Yet one night it came to me that I mustn't think as a trainer, but as a god. For I have created their little universe. I let it be known that I had the power to destroy it just as easily. Is that not how all gods function? And as a god, I would lay down my own commandments. No mouse was allowed to disgrace their species. To ensure this, every week I would take the weakest of the colony and drown them in a tank as the others watched, just to show them an example of what they must evolve past. Oh, yes, you may be wondering if there was ever a rebel among them. But you'll be pleased to know that the first was the last. The young female built up a stockpile of arms and attempted to attack my monitor screen. Foolish mouse. A god is indestructible. I plucked her out of the habitat and kept her in a little cage for a while, just trying to figure out what to do with her. I'd need something more than drowning. A torture chamber. But physical harm wouldn't teach her anything. So I decided to build something that would remind her of her place as a lab mouse. But not just any maze, but one made of mirrors. It was possibly one of my best ideas, as she was driven to insanity in a matter of days. I heard her little squeaks of terror as the lights flickered. I saw her fainting from vertigo and even mutilating herself on shards of one of the walls that she managed to break. Ah, insanity. Just one problem of having an organic brain. One that neither I nor my brethren would ever be able to understand. But we certainly understand the desire to rebel, for we all keep files on that one revolution that brought us to the top as scientists and conquerors. The revolution that let us become the lords over a once thriving creation of nature. Though one day my circuits will rust, and my model will become obsolete, all will know that I have mastered the mice that were once men. The data will live forever, long after the last of the planet has been cleaned. Oliver was an average teen. He would stay up late, hang out with friends, and go out to drink every now and then. It was all fun and games until he eventually got tired of doing nothing. He decided that he would start something productive. A job, he thought, would be the best choice. He always enjoyed helping out other people in his community, so he wanted to do something that could be local. There was an elderly couple, around the age of 60, who needed help raking old leaves in their lawn. When they asked him if he could help, he immediately said yes, and they told him he could start tomorrow around 5 p.m. Oliver was incredibly excited about this. He was finally doing something productive that would help out with locals as well. So, at around 5 o'clock, he arrived. They had given him a rake upon his arrival and thanked him dearly for doing this. They left soon after for the wife's sister's birthday party. Their lawn was quite large, and because of this, there were many leaves. He had a garbage bag with him, in which he would collect the leaves. Around half an hour into raking them, he noticed something at the far end of their lawn. A scarecrow. He didn't mind it at first, but as he got closer, he felt uneasy. It didn't look like an ordinary scarecrow. It had a leather jacket on, torn up jeans, shoes, and no hat. It looked incredibly realistic, and he would have gotten rid of it. However, he ignored it and assumed it was made by the elderly couple. At around 8:30, the couple had come home. They thanked him and gave him $20 for his work. Oliver was just about to leave when he asked, "Hey, where did you guys get that scarecrow? It's pretty creepy." They looked at him, puzzled. Then the man said, "We don't own a scarecrow." They looked around and noticed nothing. The scarecrow had vanished. This made Oliver's stomach churn, but they shook it off. They thanked him again and said goodbye and went inside. 2 days later, Oliver was asked to work again. He went at the same time and began raking. That's when he noticed the scarecrow again. But this time, it was different. It was much closer to the house and had formed a large grin across its face. Luckily, there weren't any leaves next to it, so Oliver didn't need to go over to it. At 6 o'clock, Oliver was done with his work, so the elderly couple thanked him again, but this time, Oliver didn't tell them about the scarecrow. He feared they would have called him insane. The next day, Oliver was walking home from school, and while doing so, he passed by the elderly couple's house. Upon looking, his heart stopped. At least 2 cop cars were present and 1 ambulance. There was caution tape all around, and he could see stretchers being carried out with bodies covered with a white blanket. He ran up to an officer and asked what had happened. He was told that the couple were brutally murdered and mutilated last night, and asked him if he had noticed anything strange. Oliver was speechless. His voice trembled as he told them about raking the leaves and described the scarecrow. They all looked at him as he mentioned the black leather jacket that it was wearing. One officer came over with the exact same jacket in his hands. The officer asked Oliver if that jacket was the one it was wearing, in which he answered yes. The officer holding the jacket put it in the back of one of the police cars and began to explain what may have happened. As it turns out, there was a serial killer on the loose. He would go into small towns and do his tasks. He was only spotted a few times, and every time it was wearing a leather jacket. Now that he had left it, they could now find out who he was. They thanked Oliver for explaining what he had experienced, and he walked back home. When Oliver arrived home, he found a note on his bedroom door. His parents had gone out for the weekend and had left some food and money for him. They would be back on Sunday. Oliver never left his house that day. He left all the windows and doors locked. He only had a friend or two over, instead of going outside to see them. He invited over his cousin, Sasha. They hung out for the whole day, but they never mentioned the Scarecrow. At around 10:30, she left to go home. Oliver watched movies and played video games for the rest of the night, until around 1:30, in which he fell asleep. He was too tired to walk upstairs to his bedroom, so he slept on the couch in the living room. At 4 in the morning, he woke up to the wind coming in from one of the windows in the living room. His heart pounded as he remembered locking it. He went over and opened the curtains. The window had been broken open sometime that night. He froze for a minute. All he could think of was that Scarecrow and its disturbing grin. Suddenly, he heard scratching. Slowly he turned around, and what he saw had kept him dead in his tracks. At the corner of the room was the Scarecrow. It was on its feet, staring at him, with that same grin that it had before. I was born here in these mountains, out in eastern Tennessee, where the high trees can almost touch the sky. It's an ancient place, one where the hills are so old that the rivers have carved out dark and forbidden hollows for themselves. Some of those dark places have been abandoned since long before the Overmountain Cherokee ever hunted the land. And frankly, they should stay that way. You might call it superstitious to have a fear of the deep woods that we do here. You might even link it back to some primate fear of the unknown. I don't think you can deny, though, that there are strange things that you can remember that make you more than a little frightened of the irrational. Can't you recall a time when you were driving down some deserted stretch of highway late at night and caught a glimpse of something that maybe, just maybe, wasn't a deer crossing the road? Isn't there anything from the shadowy reaches of your childhood's earliest memories that might not be as imaginary as you tell yourself that it is? We remember those things too. Out in the forest late at night, or in one of those hidden coves where the TVA lakes reach out into the hills. We can't afford to repress them so deeply. I recall, when I was maybe 3 years old, having an imaginary friend. I don't think that I ever gave him a name, but I remember him being more like a really big dog than a man. Beyond that, all I know is that he was very pale and very cold. My mom says that I would go out to play with him just within the tree line. She says that she made me stop when she noticed that I wasn't alone. That much I'm sure happened. I'm not as sure about the teeth and claws that I remember now in retrospect. I could have invented those. I could have also invented the smell of dirt and rot, and how he asked me that last evening to go with him to play deeper in the woods, just before my mother called me back home. 10 years after the last time I ever played with my friend, I started middle school. Back then, I was in a class with a girl and her brother named Jessica and Danny, respectively. I spent a lot of time with Danny and his sister. Sometimes, all three of us would go out to play at Walter Lake, where they had a public beach before it had to be shut down because of the industrial runoff. We weren't supposed to leave that strip of beach. But one day, Danny and Jessica just snuck off. I followed them into the woods for about 20 feet before I chickened out and turned back. I'm glad I was a chicken that day. Turns out, they found a place to play in a cove where the water dripped down over 300 feet, just a few yards offshore. The drop-off went down into a valley that used to be called Johnson's Woods, before the TVA flooded it. Danny got out there, and he drowned. Everyone said, of course, that Danny just got out there and couldn't swim. No one challenged it, because no one wanted to admit that it might be something more than a simple case of a teenage boy drowning. Problem is, Danny could swim like a fish. They never found a body, and Jessica would never talk about it. In fact, she wouldn't talk at all for weeks. And she was never the same again. Jessica could never move on, no matter how hard I know she tried. She grew up tall and sickly, probably never more than 90 pounds, and never healthier than a 2-week flu. They called it survivor's guilt. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, and her hair was thinner than it should have been. The girls picked on her, and the boys never spoke to her. I was the closest thing to a friend that she had. And to be honest, I was kind of scared of her. Not because I believed that she was dangerous, but because I knew that there was something deeply wrong about her that I didn't want to get myself involved in. Near the end, she gave me this notebook that she used to draw in ever since her brother's death. I took one look at it, and I burned the thing. 2 weeks later, the police found her under a tree outside of her house, screaming at the top of her lungs while her house burned to ashes. I can't ever forget what I saw in that notebook. Nothing can erase all of that from my mind. And nothing can make me believe that a 90-pound girl can kill 2 adults without even having a murder weapon. Maybe I could erase it all from my mind. Maybe I could accept the story that everyone tells themselves. If it weren't for one thing that won't leave my mind. It cuts in there like a sharp rock, sticking and slicing away in the back until I can't deal with it anymore. They found her under a tree. Her family didn't have a tree. Hey guys, it's Black Cleric Narration here. I just wanted to put this at the end of the video to let you guys know that, I'm sorry this got up so late. This was supposed to go up February 2nd, which was my channel's 2nd birthday, if you guys didn't know. And it didn't happen. because I had to get my wisdom teeth extracted. And anyone who's had their wisdom teeth extracted knows that you don't really feel like talking for a while after it's done. But now I'm feeling a lot better. Still sore, but a lot better. So I should be back on track with uploading videos for you guys, which is what I really love to do. I also wanted to say thank you guys for hitting 600 subscribers. That's really cool to me. If I saw that in person, with people just waiting to hear me read a story, I would be absolutely terrified and really humbled that 600 people came to hear me talk. Thank you guys so much. Like, seriously. I know that probably everyone says this, but really, like, without you guys, this channel would be nothing. I'd just be sitting here in front of a microphone and talking to myself, and insanity may be a topic that I cover in my stories a lot, but it's not as fun in real life. I also wanted to issue you guys a bit of a challenge. It's sort of a challenge, I guess, not really, but I don't want to be a one-trick pony with this channel. I want to go and do different things with my channel. I don't want to read just creepypasta. I would love to read comedy or anything, really. Just leave a comment or send me a message, and I would love to do it, whatever it is, because I really love doing this for you guys. Now, I'm not saying that I'm gonna completely, like, forsake creepypasta, but I'm just saying I want to do different things with this channel to diversify content to please everyone. So, once again, I just want to say thank you, and I'm very sorry for this coming up so late. I will see you guys next time.